A lot of intent.
Yeah, So, focusing, we got a reply. You remember Pamela inflamed Dr. Alexander back at what's the name of that place? Carbondale, Southern Illinois University, by her rash and wildly eclectic efforts to link Jung with Teilhard and John Dewey. And then I wrote him a letter, which I sent to him last week, and it was a 6-page letter.
Love those words.
And it worked, and he's written back along also with Mark Johnson. I have another letter from Mark Johnson. And Mark Johnson is the man who wrote this book, The Body in the Mind, which all of you may want to look at sometime. I recommend it. It's very interesting. And there's a hint here of a new relationship that could develop between Jung, linguistics theory, legitimized linguistics theory, not weirdo, but legitimized, in the mainstream, and John Dewey. And there's just the faintest hints, but it's just beginning to develop. And this is, I agree with Alexander that it's on the cutting edge. It isn't my cutting edge, but it's the cutting edge of what's going on now, and it's very important. So The Body in the Mind by Mark Johnson is a very interesting book and has a lot of implications, I think, for archetypal psychology. Well, I didn't want to belabor this, but something that bears on the class and the issue that I'm bringing up here as to our methods and so on. So let me just show you one comment that Alexander gives me. Now, first, he agrees essentially with nearly everything I said. He apologizes for the fact that he had read Jung and Teilhard some time ago and not remembered too well everything they said, and he wasn't that familiar with them. He does make a very odd comment here at the bottom. He says, "Perhaps I've got Jung wrong too. Even so, I found his views, when I read them, highly idiosyncratic and without much empirical support." Now there's our word empirical, and you see, as psychologists who want to learn about Jung, or philosophers, we want to know what Jung meant by empirical and how we could answer this man who feels Jung did not give adequate empirical support to his views. When he says idiosyncratic, what does he mean by idiosyncratic?
Off on his own tangent.
Off on his own tangent in a highly personalized way that isn't really, pardon?
Peculiar to his own experience.
Peculiar to his own experience and so on, yeah. And then he goes on. On the other hand, I think it is one of the real weaknesses of Dewey's philosophy not to have a more developed theory of the unconscious. Perhaps my distaste for Jung simply lies in the unfortunate ways in which his ideas were used by the Nazis. Now, isn't that an interesting thing? Now, I don't happen to know of this. Possibly, maybe there's something to do with the Aryan race and their archetypes. Maybe. Does anyone know anything about this?
He talks about it in one of the chapters, just in terms of how the Aryan race is an archetype.
Yeah.
I've read several times that he's been dismissed because there's some thought that in the early 30s he supported the Nazi views, and later he wound up, he was in an organization that had some Nazi affiliations, and then when they refused to admit a Jewish doctor, he resigned as head of the organization. But a lot of people dismiss him because they believe that he was pro-Nazi, and I think that the most that actually has been done to link him is that he felt that due to some of the archetypal natures and the mythic symbolism of the Aryan type, that it might be something positive for the German people.
I can see that. And Nietzsche was also accused of this. Nietzsche has some ideas that Hitler used in Mein Kampf. And then people dismiss Nietzsche as worthless because they say he was used by the Nazis. This is what we call, yeah, what we call an ad hominem argument in critical thinking. You argue against the man rather than against his ideas or her ideas. And even there, though, it isn't really even a valid argument against the man, because neither Jung nor Nietzsche were Nazis, and I'm sure that Nazism would have been abhorrent to Nietzsche, and it certainly was abhorrent to Jung, because we've seen him time and again, even in the movie, talking about how monstrous this was. And in fact, I think the Nazi phenomenon became for Jung, in his understanding, a monster of the archetypes running away with themselves and going wild, and we got that in the movie. So, Alexander says that he is willing to possibly reevaluate it, and then toward the end, he mentions something that is of special interest to us, and let me find it here. It has to do with ego, and now I've forgotten just where it was in the text. Oh dear, where is it? And he says, anyway, I hope Pamela is still pursuing her philosophical interests. He was afraid maybe he
He blew it for me.
blew it for you, yes. Okay, oh, here it is. As for Jung, well, the sheer absence of the experimental spirit in him, however broadly construed, was always a barrier for me, as was the notion of the collective unconscious.
He misunderstood him.
Yes. Again, Dewey would be very cautious to posit to posit something like a collective unconscious. At best, I think he would see a commonality in terms of our embodiment, very much like Johnson's view. But culture and local influence would generate very different cultural memories, which would be inculcated rather than naturally absorbed in our mother's milk, so to speak. So to speak, indeed. Likewise, to speak of a true ego behind the socially constructed persona strikes me as very different from Dewey's theory of personality. This would be just where Dewey would be wary of another dualism being foisted upon us. Now, there's so much here that I almost am sorry that I brought it up, but let's try to treat each of those just briefly, and then as we go on,
Again?
yeah,
Alexander?
I will be happy to read it. Oh, you know who he is? His name is Thomas Alexander. He's
Sounds like a great course, Philosophy of Thomas Alexander.
well, he is a Dewey expert, and obviously not a Jung expert. Now let's look at each one in turn, and then this will give us a stage for what we want to go into as we move into back into the Jung text. Lots of time, so no problem. Let's start out first with the collective unconscious problem. He says, no, let's start out with the experimental spirit first of all. Now, I don't know what he's talking about, but I have a feeling that he has identified experimentalism in psychology with behavioral and clinical type experimentalism. I think that's probably what is happening here. So many people do this. They think that there are no other modes of experiment. Even so, even if that were the case, Jung's theory of the unconscious mind came from the word association experiments primarily. And those were clinically acceptable, you know, and massive in proportion. People don't, I think, when they read Jung, don't go back to when he was doing this, back at Berkholtz, is that, what's the name of that place? I never can remember the exact title. But back in those days, when he was first encountering Freud and so on, they were carrying out long, involved series of word association experiments, and they analyzed them minutely and discovered patterns behind the slips, other than Freudian slips. And a great amount of material came out of this, and Jung goes back to that. Secondly, Jung analyzed thousands of cases, himself and others with him, working with him, and his background is based on these cases. Even in the I Ching, when he talks about synchronicity, and in his introduction to the I Ching, he gives discussion of his interest in astrology, and he instituted experiments where he took case studies of married couples, analyzed their signs, and then looked at their interrelationships to see if the astrological data had any relationship to their relationship problems. And I think he came up with not too much results, and he concluded that it wasn't that much. I think that it's quite wrong to say Jung does not have the experimental spirit, but I think that people don't understand or appreciate the degree to which Jung engaged in experimental work, primarily because he doesn't report that so much in some of his more popular works. I think to really find out the experimental background of Jung, you'd have to do heavy research into Jung's history, and you might find stuff that wasn't even in Jung's own works. Because what he does is he refers to it, but he doesn't lay it out so much in his own works. So maybe that's a failing of Jung's, not to make it as clear. I don't know, I think he makes it pretty clear. I've never had a feeling of lack of experimental activity on Jung's part. Now, what's experimental? You work with the people in case histories, and you lay out the case histories. That's the only way you can experiment in some of this, yeah.
My feeling from what he has said is that he is reacting to Jung as a cultural phenomenon. He's not really dealing with Jung per se. And I sense a real fear involved here. And the comments like idiosyncratic, a lack of experimental. What I gather is that he feels that this is very dangerous stuff as a cultural phenomenon.
Yes.
If you let this stuff loose, it's going
Yes.
to lead to the very
Yes.
kinds of things that the Nazis got involved.
Yes, now.
Talk about the collective unconscious and archetypes and like this. When it gets out there, it's going to be very, very dangerous. And we should control it by bringing it within the framework of institutions. So when he talks about experiments, he doesn't mean going off by yourself and doing experiments, no matter how objective they may be, but rather bring them into the laboratories within university institutions or governmental institutions. Of some kind.
We saw this in that first slide. There it was all there in that slide, wasn't it? The fear of that. You see, Jung is daring to approach this material, which was so freeing of the unconscious, that the church and all the other institutions clamped the lid on it and said, let's keep it secret, let's stamp it, imprimatur, or whatever, get it under control. They burn witches because of this, or so-called witches, right? And yes, and there's even more and more to say about that. What were you going to...
Oh, just that on the one hand, it seems like you can be accused of being a behaviorist, and on the other hand, I mean, if you go too far in the one direction, the experimental method, and on the other hand, a subjectivist, if you're trying to study the unconscious at all as a subject matter.
Yes.
Because once the object is the subject, you
Yes.
kind of have a problem in the usual easy...
Well, then we've defined a core problem of Jungian psychology and philosophy, and it is really an intersection of psychological and philosophical issues, and it's empiricism. Can there be an empirical psychology? And if so, philosophy can help by developing a philosophy of empiricism, by defining